It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Karen Van Vuren, Chief Marketing Officer. Karen, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled Web Accessibility and Introduction to WCAG 2.0. I'm Karen Van Vuren, Chief Marketing Officer at Usablenet, and I will host this webinar in partnership with Gian Wild, CEO of Accessibility Oz. Accessibility Oz is an accessibility consultancy with offices in Australia and the US and a Usablenet partner. Before I go too far into the webinar, let me just do a few housekeeping things. Our webinar today will last roughly 45 minutes. During this discussion, all participants will be on mute. So if you have a question, please remember to use the tool to enter the question, and we'll read those out at the end of the webinar. We will be posting and tweeting to hashtag WCAG, and we invite you to do the same. We'll also be sending a replay to the webinar for everyone who registered, and the recording of the webinar will be available on usablenet.com under the Resources tab. Before I introduce Gian, let me just give a brief introduction to Usablenet. We are a global technology services company focused on helping over 350 companies across all industries create amazing experiences for their customers on mobile, on tablet, kiosks, desktop, and even in apps. We were founded in 2000 as a web accessibility company, helping our clients to make their desktop sites accessible to users with visual disability, and Amtrak was our very first client. Today, our client portfolio includes brands such as JetBlue, Ritz-Carlton, Dell, and FedEx, and retail brands in the US and UK such as John Lewis, J.Crew, and CVS. Usablenet's capabilities not only include the design and build of mobile experiences, but also professional services, API services, and technology solutions. Our team of highly skilled professionals are expert at helping clients conceptualize and execute mobile strategies that include best-in-class UX, QA testing, and accessibility audits. In fact, our suite of web accessibility products and services enable clients to support WCAG 2.0 AA level of web accessibility across all their digital channels. And we'll learn a little bit more about that today. Our patented technology platform called UXperience enables clients to get APIs in place quickly to implement their mobile strategies. Now let me introduce Gian, who will lead today's discussion on web accessibility, and she will share her expertise to help us understand the topic and the requirements of WCAG 2.0 for websites and mobile sites a little bit better. As I mentioned before, Gian Wild is the CEO of Accessibility Oz, a web accessibility consultancy. She's worked in the accessibility industry since 1998. In addition to consulting on the development of the very first level AAA accessible website in Australia for Disability Information Victoria, Gian has an extensive experience working on web accessibility guidelines for the internet as a whole. In this area, her work includes being in on the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and she has also spent 6 years contributing to the development of WCAG 2, which is the topic of our discussion today. And with that, Gian, I'd like to hand over to you to take it away.
Thank you, Karen. That's really a great introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Today, we're going to talk about WCAG 2, and I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction about people with disabilities and how they access the web, what your legal requirements are, litigation in the accessibility area, and that's when I'll get into some WCAG 2 examples and how you deal with having an accessibility problem. We'll have questions at the end, and yeah, I hope you enjoy yourselves. So let's talk about online accessibility. What is online accessibility? It's the ability for a person with a disability to understand and use a website, application, mobile app, program, etc. So if you think about it, someone who's vision impaired, who is blind, for example, 10 to 15 years ago, if they wanted to follow the the primaries race, they'd have to go to a special library and access a a braille newspaper, whereas now they can go online and they can follow the activities of all the Republican and Democrat primary candidates as they happen. It's governed in the US by a whole range of different things. The Rehabilitation Act, Section 503, 504, 508, the Air Carrier Act, the Communication Act and ADA, and Department of Justice and Department of Transport are involved in this as well. And basically it's achieved by following the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2. So when we're talking about people with disabilities, who are we actually talking about? There's 4 groups of people with disabilities that are affected by an inaccessible website. That's people with vision impairments, which include people who are blind, colourblind, have glaucoma, cataracts, etc. And they use technologies such as screen readers, which read aloud the content on the page. So that's how they access websites. Or they might increase text size or use an on-screen magnifier. Then there are people with hearing impairments, people who are profoundly deaf or hard of hearing. There are many people that acquire hearing disabilities, especially as they get older. People with hearing impairments, if they're born deaf, completely deaf, their first language is actually American Sign Language. And American Sign Language doesn't have the grammatical construction of English that we're used to. So people who are born profoundly deaf often find it quite difficult to read complex sentences. So one of the things that we can do for people like that is actually provide clear and simple content. But other things that you can do to assist people with hearing impairments are things like adding captions to videos and things like that. Then there are people with physical impairments. So we're talking about people with cerebral palsy, quadriplegia, Huntington's, Parkinson's, etc. And what this means is that someone with a physical impairment has problems accessing an input device. So when I say an input device, I mean a mouse, a keyboard, a touch screen. So people with physical impairments are either restricted to one of those input devices, so a keyboard, for example, or they've actually got a different input device that mimics those standard input devices. So a joystick, for example, that mimics a mouse, an on-screen keyboard that mimics a keyboard, etc., etc. And so keyboard accessibility is incredibly important to people with physical impairments. And the last group is people with cognitive impairments. So we're not just talking about intellectual disabilities, and I know a lot of people think that cognitive impairments just means intellectual disabilities. But there's a huge range of cognitive disabilities, from people with epilepsy, migraines, dyslexia, aphasia, which is a type of inability to understand tone, synesthesia, which we'll give an example of later, and reading disabilities. So it's important to know that around the world, about 15 to 20% of all people around the world have some kind of disability that affects their daily life. In the US, there's approximately 7 million blind or low vision people. There are approximately 48 million deaf or hard of hearing people. There are approximately 21 million people who have physical impairment, and there's approximately 15 million people that have a cognitive impairment. So we're talking about quite a large group of people. And technology is incredibly important to these people. I'll just show you some examples from the National Federation for the Blind. This here is a globe of the world, and it's actually overlaid with a tactile representation of the countries. So this way, someone who's blind or vision impaired can get a tactile or a physical representation of the countries around the world. The next image is a 3D printed version of the Chrysler Building in New York. And the thing about, very, very large objects or very, very small objects is that someone who's blind or vision impaired obviously can't feel what they look like. So having a 3D miniature representation of these kind of items is one way for them to get an idea of what they look like. And then this third example is a video that I'm going to show you in just a moment, which is a map of tectonic plates in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's a great example of what technology really enables us to do now. And this man, he's got a pen and he presses on a particular section on the map and it tells him what the information in that map. So let's have a look at that video now.
All the way over there.
Tectonic plates. Tap the title at the top of this page for more information. Convergent boundary. Australia, located on the Indo-Australian plate. Main continent on the Indo-Australian plate, surrounded by the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The Indo-Australian plate is bounded to the south by the Antarctic plate, to the south and east by the Pacific plate, to the north by the Eurasian plate, and to the west by the African plate. Tap the pen on this smooth section of the Indo-Australian plate for more information.
There you go.
Pacific plate.
There you go.
So as you can see, it's an incredibly complicated system, but there's a whole range of different ways that people with disabilities can access content. And I mentioned before, you know, that a lot of people think cognitive disabilities have to do with intellectual disabilities. And this next example is about a woman that has synesthesia. She says, until I was 15, I thought everyone constantly saw colours. Colours in books, colours in math formulas, colours at concerts. But when I finally asked my brother which colour the letter C was, canary yellow by the way, I realised my mind wasn't quite as normal as I had thought. So when she actually hears a song, she can actually see that song. And on the left here is a representation of the Smashing Pumpkins song Tonight Tonight. And that's what she sees when she hears the song Tonight Tonight. So people with cognitive disabilities have some incredibly complicated issues, and definitely is not just people with intellectual disabilities. So let's talk about how you actually know what it is that you need to do. There are a lot of acronyms when it comes to WCAG 2, when it comes to accessibility. There's the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and there's actually quite a number of sections in there that have to do with accessibility. There's 501, which prohibits employment discrimination against individuals with disabilities in the federal sector. There's 503, which prohibits discrimination by federal subcontractors that have contracts over $10,000 against people with disabilities. There's 504, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities by any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So we're talking about colleges and airports. And Section 508, which a lot of people are aware of, which is specific to electronic discriminations and, electronic communications. And a lot of people know when working with federal departments and organisations that they need to meet Section 508 requirements. You can do that by completing a VPAT, called a Voluntary Product Assessment Template. There's also ACAA, which is the Air Carrier Access Act, and the CVAA, which is the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. And then, of course, there's the ADA as well, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's a lot of things that have to do with web accessibility. So where do you start? So you're probably all aware of Section 508, and then, of course, there's WCAG 2. They're probably the most popular. It's important to note that Section 508 is heavily based on the first version of WCAG, WCAG 1, which was released in 1999. And really, you know, it's out of date now. It's nowhere near as comprehensive as WCAG 2. Section 508 is also only relevant to federal organisations and products procured by federal organisations. And so some of the differences between WCAG 2 and Section 508 are things like lack of meaningful sequence, which occur in WCAG 2 and not Section 508, colour contrast, resizing text, keyboard traps, error messages and suggestions. So really, if you're not sure whether you need to meet WCAG 2 or Section 508, you really should look at following WCAG 2. It's much more comprehensive, and in the litigation in the area, which we'll talk about in a moment, people, especially Department of Justice, are very much referencing WCAG 2. They're not referencing Section 508 anymore. So there's one case where WCAG 2 is not actually enough, and that's got to do with the Air Carrier Access Act. So they released an update 3 years ago, and they require WCAG 2 compliance of the following web pages by December last year in 2015. And quite specific pages, so booking or changing a reservation, including all flight amenities, checking in for a flight, accessing a personal travel itinerary, accessing the status of a flight, accessing a personal frequent flyer account, accessing flight schedules, and accessing carrier contact information. So that's all about WCAG 2 compliance, but it also requires usability testing of these systems by people with disabilities, and that's not something that's required with WCAG 2. And so that's something that we do at Usablenet. We've done a number of those usability tests. The ACAA updates, the thing to remember, is that there's actually an additional set of requirements that come into account at December 2016, which requires all of an airline's website to be fully WCAG 2 accessible, not just those groups. So when we're talking about accessibility, I just want to give you a bit of an example of some of the failures that we've seen in our testing of airlines. So this is use of colour. This is a seat map, and you can see you've got yellow seats and green seats and red seats, and there's a legend elsewhere on the page to indicate what that is. Now what that does is that uses colour to convey information. So if you were colourblind, for example, you were red-green colourblind, you wouldn't know the difference between the green seats and the red seats. The other thing is that screen readers, which people with vision impairments use, don't read aloud the colour of certain items, so they won't get that information either. So that's an example of a failure of WCAG 2 Success Criterion 1.4.1. And a better way to do it is something like this, where you've got the seats outlined in blue, and then you've got a little text to the right that says main cabin extra. And then further down you've got the seats in yellow, and you've got also the indications that those are exit, little icons that show that those are exit row seats. So that would be a way to not rely entirely on colour, and that passes WCAG 2 Success Criterion 1.4.1 use of colour. So why? Let's talk about why you need to meet accessibility requirements. There's a number of prominent legal accessibility precedents. The first one started in Australia. The very first accessibility litigation was in Australia, and it was against the Sydney Operating Commission of the Olympic Games. Their website, the Sydney Olympics website, was not accessible, and they were taken to federal court, and the plaintiff was found successful. They were fined, the judge fined them $20,000. He deemed that it would have cost them $10,000 to make their site accessible, so he doubled that figure. However, their legal fees were in excess of $500,000, and they landed on the front page of every newspaper in Australia, and I was working in accessibility at the time, and it was a big deal. And it's very well known as the thing that started accessibility litigation. A few years back, there was a lawsuit against Target.com by the National Federation for the Blind. They settled out of court, and they settled for $6 million, and their legal fees were in excess of $3.5 million. And Target now has some really excellent accessibility features on their site. The Government of Canada was sued by an employee. The Government of Canada had decided about 3 or 4 years back that they weren't going to endorse WCAG 2, that they were going to remain using WCAG 1. And a Canadian government employee sued them and said that as person with a vision impairment, WCAG 1 wasn't enough for her to do her job, and that really they needed to meet WCAG 2 requirements. The judge found in favour of the plaintiff and ordered that the Government of Canada make all their Canadian government websites accessible to WCAG 2 within 18 months. And then there's Netflix. Netflix was sued about 2.5 years ago by the National Association of the Deaf, who for not having captions on their content. Now, Netflix streams content that's often been shown on TV, and when it's shown on TV it has captions, but none of the content in Netflix had captions. They argued that it would be a breach of copyright to add captions to their content, and the judge once again ruled in favour of the plaintiff, fined Netflix $795,000 and ordered them to add captions within 18 months. The interesting thing that happened is about a year ago, Netflix released a TV show called Daredevil, which is about a blind superhero. Now, people who are deaf, in order to understand TV content, they need captions. But people who are blind, in order to understand TV content, they need what we call video or audio descriptions, which describe what's happening on the screen. So when Netflix released this TV show about a blind superhero, they released it with captions, but they didn't release it with audio descriptions. And the accessibility community was up in arms because, you know, you'd think that people interested in a blind superhero might be themselves vision impaired. And to Netflix's credit, they actually added audio descriptions within 3 days. To the entire series, and they really are very excellent audio descriptions. So I suggest if you're interested in something like that, have a look at the Netflix Daredevil series and turn on audio descriptions because they really are very, very good. In terms of commercial entities, quite recently there's been a number of different lawsuits. Peapod Grocery Delivery was settled out of court, but their web and mobile sites must be made accessible, which is interesting because WCAG 2 is not entirely good at dealing with mobile sites. They also need to engage independent accessibility consultancy and have a designated employee specifically for web accessibility. Then we've got Home Devo, NBA and Toys R Us, which all are requiring WCAG 2 accessibility or specifically accessibility to people with vision impairments. So let's talk about WCAG 2. WCAG 2 was developed by the W3C, an international vendor-neutral organisation. Version 1 was released in 1999 and version 2 was released in 2008. It was written by accessibility specialists, people with disabilities and software vendors, and I spent 6 years with the working group writing WCAG 2. WCAG 2 has 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. And each principle has a set of guidelines. Each guideline has a set of success criteria, and each success criterion has sufficient advisory and failure techniques. There are 3 conformance levels: level A, AA and AAA, level A being the lowest and AAA being the highest. And across the world, level AA is seen as the standard to achieve. Conformance is for full web pages and complete processes only. So you can't say, for example, that your front home page is accessible except for the advertisement on the right-hand side. And you also can't say our checkout process is accessible except for the 4th page, because the entire process needs to be accessible. And also, if you can actually say a section of my website is not WCAG 2 compliant, say your publication section or something like that. Of course, you could still be liable to litigation, but that section that's not WCAG 2 compliant still needs to meet what we call the 4 non-interference clauses, and let's talk about them now. So the first one is audio control, and a good example of a failure of this is YouTube. So with audio control, you need to be able to pause the audio if it starts automatically immediately when you enter the site. With YouTube, when you enter the site, your keyboard focus is actually underneath the video. And so in order to pause the video and pause the audio, you have to backwards tab over 10 times, which you can imagine is quite difficult to do and probably almost impossible if you're using something like a screen reader. Then the next one is no keyboard trap. And this basically is for people who are reliant only on the keyboard. You can see the keyboard focus starts in the middle at the top of the page on the search bar and then moves backwards to the YouTube logo and then skips over the search and goes to the upload, and then the next tab takes you to an advertisement, which is actually a keyboard trap. And the only way that you can escape from a keyboard trap is to actually stop the browser and reopen it again. So if someone comes across a keyboard trap in your site, they're unlikely to come back to your site. And the third issue is 3 flashes or below threshold. So this is flickering content. You need to be very careful about flickering content because it can trigger epileptic attacks and migraines. And there's actually a case in Japan in 1997 where a TV show called Pokemon had flickering content and 700 people ended up in hospital with epileptic attacks. So that's something that you absolutely can't include anywhere. And then this one is, the last one is pause, stop, hide. Now this is eBay, and this is actually passes the pause, stop, hide, because although there is movement, it stops within 5 seconds. So if you have movement, you have to be able to pause it, or it needs to stop within 5 seconds. So let's talk about the principle. Perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. One implication of this principle is that information cannot be presented in a form that is only available through one sense, such as providing only a visual form of a capture. And captures are those squiggly things where you're filling out a form and it says, tell me what those letters are. So let's talk about some examples of Perceivable. This here is the Space Needle website, and their front page has this beautiful image of the Space Needle with the text, visit the needle, hours and directions, observation deck, etc. Now the alt attribute, which is what a screen reader will hear, so what describes the content to someone who is vision impaired, the screen reader will read out v2 main _03 _top dash awesome. Whereas you think that a better description would be a view from the needle, including Mount St. Helens. So this fails WCAG 2 success criterion 1.1.1 non-text content. This is an example of a pass. So this is Seattle newspaper, and this is an alt attribute that's very well done, and it says Tenenyi Desta Jigsaw, an attendant for SP Plus parking, smiles as he talks about his wage increase while inputting information into his ticketing device at 2200 Westlake Plaza in Seattle on Thursday, March 31st, 2016. Now that's incredibly complex for an alt attribute. It doesn't need to be that complex, but it is an excellent alt attribute. Text. So here we've got the address of Uber Technologies, and you can see it says C/O, which visually we look at and we can see represents care of. Now we know that because we've seen that many times, but a screen reader doesn't read out grammatical marks by default. So it will just read CO, Uber Technologies Inc. And that won't necessarily make any sense to anyone. And the next row, it'll read 182 Howard Street #8 instead of number 8. So you need to be careful of your text, and this is the kind of thing that fails WCAG 2 success criterion 1.3.1, info and relationships. So let's talk about WCAG principle Operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. In other words, users must be able to operate with the user interface and navigational aspects of a website. One implication of this principle is that interaction with web content should not depend on a user being able to use a physical mouse. And we talked about this when it came to people with physical disabilities. So one of the things that's under Operable is link text. So you need to actually make sure that your link text makes sense. Now, you can see here the link text is threatened to have a columnist, chokeslammed, nothing new, he said every person. Now, that doesn't make sense to anybody, and one of the things that a screen reader can do is actually pull out all the links in a page. So you can imagine if you had a list of those links, you would have no idea where it was that you were going. So it is important that your link text indicates where you're linking to. Focus order. Now, this is the Amazon registration page, and you've got all this information about registering an account, and then underneath the submit button there is the text, by creating an account you agree to Amazon.com's conditions of use and privacy notice. Now, that's of course incredibly important information, but because it's after the submit button, it fails WCAG 2 success criterion 2.4.2 focus order. And the reason why it fails that is because people who use a screen reader, they'll fill out the form, get to the submit button, hit submit, and they won't know that content is there. But also people who use a magnifier, they only see a very, very small part of the screen, so maybe 1 or 2 letters at a time. And once again, they'll get down to that submit button, hit submit, and they won't see that information, which is incredibly important to know before signing up to Amazon. This is another failure of focus order. This is the Pokemon shop that I mentioned before, a Pokemon episode that I mentioned before. And so it's an article about this, this episode, and there's actually a video of the flickering content, and underneath the video it says, if you'd like to see the sequence in question, you can view it in this clip, but be warned, you obviously do so at your own risk. Now, not only does it fail 3 flashes or below threshold because it shows that flickering content, it fails focus order because that warning occurs after the actual event. And you can imagine if you're reading through, you might not read that content. And once again, it would be problematic for people on a mobile device, using a screen reader, using a magnifier. The third principle is understandable. Information and the operation of user interface components must be understandable. In other words, users must be able to understand both the information, content, and how to interact with it. One implication of this principle is that changes of content or context must not be triggered unexpectedly. So one of the examples that we talk about is consistent identification. So if you have something that you use throughout the site, you need to identify across the site consistently, and there's a consistent navigation requirement as well. So this is a mobile app, and it has a little circle at the top of one of the images, and if you tap on that image, it shows you a larger version of that image. And if you go to another page, that same circle appears, and when you tap on that image, you get exactly the same representation that you did before. It's just, of course, a different image. And that passes WCAG 2 success criterion 3.2.4 consistent identification. Another example of principle understandable is error identification. So it's really important that you identify to users where errors occur and you describe what that error is in text. So here we've put in www.usablenet.com and it's come back with an error, and it says, please enter a valid website URL, e.g. http ://www.gravityforms.com. Now, to most people, www.usablenet.com is a valid URL. Technical people in my audience will know that it's not technically valid, that it needs that HTTP beforehand. But the majority of users aren't going to know exactly what's wrong with that URL. So that's where error identification is really important, and that fails WCAG 2 success criterion 3.3.1, error identification. And then we have the last principle, which is content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. One implication of this principle is that a web page should not require the use of a specific assistive technology, such as a specific screen reader, in order to be accessible. And this is really a very technical principle. It's all about code, so we don't have any examples for you here. And just to let you know that we're merely scratching the surface of the requirements of WCAG 2, but I hope at least this has given you a good idea of what WCAG 2 encompasses. So now we've talked about all this, how do we actually do it? So there's some basic things that you can do with your own site. Unplug the mouse and see if you can move through the keyboard using the tab key and activating links and putting content into fields and buttons and things like that. So to navigate, you can use the tab key, the arrow keys, space, enter and escape, and see if you can actually move through your site using just the keyboard and the navigation. Often we find that the navigation is not fully accessible to the keyboard, and of course that's a really important part of any site. Also, try and increase the text size. So use Control+ to increase the text size and do it 6 or 7 times and see if your site still makes sense. There might be some overlapping content, there might be some missing content. And once you've done that, actually see if you can navigate through the site using the keyboard still. Also, open your site on a mobile or tablet device and use pinch zoom to see if you can actually, increase the size of various things and make sure that everything kind of makes sense. We can also run some automatic tests on your site to find out things like whether your images and forms and tables are accessible, so please feel free to get in contact with us if you have any questions. So what do you do if you actually have an accessibility problem? There's really 2 options. The first one is to engage a specialist. This is something that you really should consider if you've received a complaint from the Department of Justice or from an advocacy group. The Department of Justice have been quite active lately, and they've been sending out a lot of letters to commercial organisations regarding accessibility compliance with WCAG 2. But you might also receive a complaint by an advocacy group like the National Federation for the Blind or the National Association for the Deaf. If you have a lot of systems and you don't know where to start, that's also where you can engage a specialist. And also, if you've missed a CVAA or an ACAA deadline, then definitely engaging someone that's skilled in the area is a great idea. And the second option is building an accessibility team in-house. Just be aware that that does require budget and it does require ongoing staff, but it is a great idea, and we've helped organisations do that as well. And it's also an excellent idea if you do a lot of development in-house. So if you go through either of those options, what is it that people are likely to do? So firstly, you need to look at your systems and your applications, your mobile apps, etc., and see what is, what you should start with. So you should probably start with your most popular website or your popular mobile apps and things like that, and then develop a plan to address the accessibility compliance within your organisation. The next step would probably be to do an accessibility audit. And if you need to meet the Air Carrier Access Act requirements, then actually scheduling user testing as well. And then it would basically be a staged approach of auditing your systems and then training up developers, training up content authors, training up managers even to make sure that they know how to deal with accessibility and making those fixes. And then it's also really important that when you're dealing with accessibility, that you can't just test the system, fix the system, and then think it's all done. You need to test that system again to make sure that those accessibility requirements have been met properly. And the other thing to remember is that you've got to look at accessibility as a ongoing compliance task. It's not a project that has an end date. Certainly you're probably going to have to spend more money up front, but there will be ongoing requirements. So even if you have tested all your systems, trained up all your staff, your systems have been retested and they're all fully accessible, unless you're never going to touch those systems again, then there's going to be changes and there's going to be staff turnover. So we recommend that with a site that has very regular changes, that things are re-audited once a month. And we can do things like re-audit only those things that have changed. But things that aren't changed that often, then you can maybe re-audit them every 6 to 12 months. And we definitely recommend retraining people every 6 to 12 months as well, because, you know, new people come on board, people forget, you know, what they need to focus on and things like that. So anyway, I think that's it from me. I hope that this has been helpful, and I'd really like to hear any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gian. That was an excellent overview. We learned a great deal there, specifically around some of the terminology and the do's and don'ts, or fails and passes with WCAG. While you were talking, we did receive a number of questions. In the time that we have available, what I'm going to do is take the first top three types of questions that we got. Let me just say to everyone that if you have a question, please feel free to email us at assistive@usablenet.com, and we will absolutely make sure that your question gets addressed. So here's the first question that we want to go with. Who in the organization typically owns web accessibility? Is it the website team? Is it IT or marketing? What do you see with companies you work for?
That's an excellent question, and it really comes down to the size of the company. If you're talking about like a really large company, like a Starbucks or a McDonald's, then the CIO needs to have final say and responsibility for web accessibility, because, you know, with an organisation that large, there are a lot of people involved, and they need to basically make sure that, you know, your website team, your IT team, and your marketing communications work together to actually address accessibility requirements. And one of our clients in Australia is the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we're working with the Director of Web Services there. So that's another way of doing it. But that CIO director level is really important in those big organisations. If you're a smaller or medium organisation, I think that it's important that it sits with the web team. It depends, of course, what it is that you do. If all you have is basically a website, you don't have you know, web apps, you don't have mobile apps, things like that, then the web team is definitely where it should sit. But if you have a whole bunch of web applications, then maybe it needs to sit across the web team and the IT team, because IT has a lot to do with it as well. If you're a smaller organisation, you do more like brochure websites, then it does make sense for it to sit in the marketing team, because the marketing team is often responsible for those smaller websites, and you know, are in charge of how they get built and what is included and things like that. So really it is dependent on the size of the organisation.
Thank you, Gian. The next question here references the legal risk that you outlined earlier. Why have retailers been slow to respond, given legal risk as well as the fact that disabled consumers are still potential shoppers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, once again, an excellent question, and I'll answer the second question first. I've been working in accessibility since 1998, so for a very, very long time. And the one thing that I see over and over and over again is quite a high level of discrimination against people with disabilities. So there's this attitude that people with disabilities don't really exist or operate the way that normal people do, and I say normal in air quotes. So for example, I did some work with the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games, and we're working with the Gold Coast 2018 Commonwealth Games as well. And we met with their ticketing people, and we said, well, your ticketing system needs to be accessible. And they said, why? People with disabilities aren't going to come to the Commonwealth Games. And I was like, well, what about the Paralympics? And I said, what about your own ticketing system? And he said, well, people with disabilities don't go to concerts. And it's like, well, actually they do. They do all the things that regular people do. It's just that it's a little bit harder for them to do it. So I think in terms of why retailers ignore the disability dollar is because there's this attitude that it doesn't really exist. And that's definitely not true. People with disabilities are incredibly loyal. When they find a retailer that supports them, they will spend money there and they'll tell their friends. So, you know, there really is a disability dollar out there. In terms of why the retailers haven't addressed it, look, the Target lawsuit was a few years back, and there hasn't, everything else managed to be settled out of court. No one, well, I mean, Target was settled out of court as well, but I think that maybe the attitude is, well, we'll deal with it when we get that complaint. But, you know, these settlements, they're not short, they're not small settlements, they're 6-7 figure settlements. It's got to be cheaper to make your systems accessible than to deal with a settlement. And, you know, you do end up, you know, like there's a whole lot of bad publicity about it. And I don't know if people say any publicity is good publicity, but I'm not sure if this is the case. So I think it's more an idea that, you know, we'll deal with it when it happens. But the thing is that only in the last couple of months, and I mentioned this briefly before, only in the last couple of months has Department of Justice been sending out a huge array of letters to different organisations about their accessibility compliance. And they're really getting onto that now, and they're referencing WCAG too. They're not referencing Section 508. I think there really has been this attitude that accessibility is only a federal government issue because Section 508 is only about federal government. But Department of Justice is claiming compliance under the Americans with Disabilities Act and requiring WCAG 2 compliance. So I think maybe there's this misunderstanding that accessibility is only for those federal organisations. So yeah, so those are three of the reasons why I think that might be the case.
That's great, thank you. The third question here is a little bit more specific. What are the biggest differences in approach between web accessibility for desktop versus accessibility for mobile phones?
Yeah, that's a great question because that's something that I've focused on in the last couple of years, and I've spoken around the world on mobile accessibility. WCAG 2, when we wrote WCAG 2, we wanted it to be technology neutral. So we wanted to make it apply to any future technologies. And of course, it was released in 2008. So no one was thinking about mobile phone accessibility back then. And we really wanted it to apply properly to mobile, but it doesn't, unfortunately. There's no requirement, for example, for touch accessibility. So I mentioned before that everything needs to be keyboard accessible, but there's no requirement that everything is mouse accessible, and there's no requirement that everything is touch accessible. And I've written a couple of articles about this. So really the big difference between mobile and desktop, probably the biggest difference is that there's a huge array of different devices, operating systems and browsers. And you can have the same device. So you can have a Samsung 6 with exactly the same operating system, and you can have completely different versions of browsers that will behave completely differently. So there's the internet browser that's installed with it, Samsung, and there's Chrome browser that you can install and things like that. And they will operate differently. And then things will differ if you change the mobile from desktop to landscape. So that's a big issue because you have to deal with, you know, there's just an array of different devices, operating systems and browsers. But really, there's a couple of things that I've noticed with mobile. Firstly, when it comes to mobile, especially people that have mobile-specific websites, they seem to forget that, you know, their desktop site needs to be mobile accessible as well. They need to find a way, they need to provide a way to jump from the desktop website to the mobile site and back again. And people with severe vision impairments, for example, it doesn't matter to them how large the screen is. They often browse the web through their mobile phone because it's a whole lot easier to just have it in your pocket and browse the web and listen to your screen reader than be attached to a laptop. So they often move to your desktop site because it has more content. And this path where we're providing less content on the mobile site, I think is problematic because a lot of people are on mobile now. We actually spend more time on mobile than we do on desktops now. And I think people are expecting that they'll get the same content on both. Another thing that's really important is pinch zoom. So make sure that your mobile sites can be zoomed in using pinch zoom. And the other thing is that there are users that attach keyboards to mobile devices. So the keyboard accessibility of your mobile site is really important as well. So hopefully that answers your question. And as Karen said, we're happy to answer any further questions via email.
Thank you, Gian. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for the insights. Thank you for helping to make everyone on the phone a little bit smarter in being able to recognize the imperative of web accessibility, plus some of the things to look out for. Just like to remind everyone on the phone that you could find a little bit more information about how Usablenet might be able to help you. Our suite of web accessibility products and services can make it possible for you to have and meet the WCAG 2.0 AA web accessibility standards across every one of your digital channels. You could visit us at usablenet.com and scroll down to the product page, which is called Usablenet-Assistive. And with that, and one more reminder, for any questions that you may have that you would like answered, please send an email to assistive@usablenet.com, and we will absolutely make sure to respond to you within 24 hours. And with that, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Gian, for your time, and we hope that this has been more than useful.
Thank you very much.
If you submitted a question that was not answered, please be on the lookout for a response from assistive@usablenet.com. Thanks to all of our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This concludes our webcast, and you may now disconnect. Have a great day.